us here this morning. Good morning, my name is Margaret Kelly. I work at Cork Chamber on Public Affairs and Sustainability. And you're all very welcome to this morning's webinar, the fourth and the final Sustainable Cork Programme webinar this year. And the series, which has run over the past 3 years, is designed to set a vision for a more sustainable and resilient Cork, empowered by a thriving business community. So before I introduce our facilitator, some housekeeping this morning. We ask that you keep your mics off, and we ask that you use the chat box for Q&A, and you're also very welcome to join the discussion if you unmic and either unmic at the end to join the discussion, or you could use the chat box. And please note that we're also recording the session for our own records. So for sure, hybrid and remote working has brought change on a number of fronts over the last 2 years. And over the next hour or so, we'll be focusing on how to keep diversity, inclusion and equity at the heart of a hybrid workplace. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to extend a warm welcome to you, our audience, our expert speakers and our moderator, Siobhan Cangerton, this morning. Siobhan is the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager at MTU, Munster Technological University. So over to you, Siobhan. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret, and thank you all for joining us here this morning for what I know will be a very interesting and very relevant and very timely topic. As Margaret touched on, we've all had some challenges over the last couple of years, but also some opportunities as well. Now, as you mentioned, my job title is Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager. So you may notice equality and equity, slight difference there, and I'm sure our speakers will touch on it as well. But just to clarify, from my understanding, equality is when we're thinking of the outcome, we're thinking of the opportunities we want to give people access to, whereas equity is about the treatment. So we can't treat all people the same way and expect them all to have the same outcome. It's about recognizing the diversity of different people's needs and then respecting those and meeting those so that we are all able to achieve the same equal opportunities. And this is an easy trap we can fall into when it comes to hybrid working, because we can try and standardize everything and try and make it one size fits all. But I know our speakers are going to touch on this and help us as we try and tackle this and many other challenges to do with hybrid working and keeping that DEI on track. So our first speaker, I'm so excited to see her content, is Terry Maloney. She's non-executive director and independent consultant for employee success. Terry, over to you, and I'm looking forward to speaking afterwards.
Good morning, everybody. And Margaret and Siobhan, thank you very much for having me here today. I am going to share my screen just to make sure everyone can see what's going on here. Siobhan, does that look okay there to you?
Hang on, it seems to be just in presenter mode rather than if you go to
Sorry.
Thank presenter view. Yeah. See, this is the joys of the hybrid event environment. Yes. We are always learning.
Slideshow. Let's start. All right, how does that look?
Great, thank you. Crack on.
Thank you. So yes, good morning again, everybody. My name is Terry Maloney. I'm an independent non-executive director. My previous experience, and as you can see here at the bottom of the screen, my most recent experience was with Salesforce. Many of you probably know Salesforce. It's a CRM, customer relationship management software company. But before that, I'd also worked in some amazing companies and big brands like Boston Scientific, like Hilti and Kerry Group. So I'm an alumni from all of those companies, and I've taken great lessons and learnings along the way. I'm here today to talk about equality, diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equality and inclusion, as long as it's not diversity, inclusion and equality, because I think the acronym there isn't great. But I did want to spend a moment just to kind of look at each of these pillars a little bit separately to talk to you sort of about some of the differences. Siobhan already alluded to that. But for me, I think diversity, which is kind of where we all started on this, is about seeing differences. And, you know, you think about diversity, and particularly for a multinational company like Salesforce or Boston, diversity is really about representation. And for those of you sort of working sort of or in contact with US companies particularly, you'll know that there's a big emphasis on representation of Black women in the organization. And in different other countries and different regions, the emphasis is slightly different. In Ireland, and certainly in the companies I've worked with, the emphasis has been on women, so gender diversity, and also on ability, or disability diversity. So they're the two areas that we tend to focus on primarily in Ireland. Although we are sort of moving, I think, to look at other differences and socioeconomic background and so on to make sure that we're truly diverse organizations. Equality then, I think, is, as Siobhan said, it's about equality and equity are closely tied together. But equality for me is really about your systems, about your processes, making sure that there is equity, that there is equal pay, for equal work, that there are opportunities, equal opportunities for people, depending on their life stage or their demographic. And I think, employees certainly need to feel and perceive equality and fairness of opportunity in organizations for them to believe that the organization is truly equal. And that can be difficult, certainly around transparency, around equality systems and processes and outcomes. The last area, I think inclusion is probably one that we're still sort of trying to get to grips with a little bit. Inclusion for me is really about belonging, and it's about the culture of the organization and everyone really feeling that they can be their authentic self at work, that it's a psychologically safe place to be, and that they actually engage with the organization in a way that sort of is more than just employee-employer relationship. So, I just wanted to kind of start there in terms of framing, I suppose, each of the areas. I think belonging is probably where a lot of organizations are. And I think belonging is particularly relevant as we move sort of into sort of the new world of work. I will say that DE&I, so all of these areas are absolutely essential at every stage of the employee journey. So, how you attract employees, what your job descriptions say, how do you avoid bias in job descriptions. I recently spoke to an engineering company who have decided to take the word engineer out of their job descriptions because it was seen as more of a masculine trait. And so now they're talking about sort of, professionals, so different types of professionals that they need in their organization rather than engineer per se. And some of the roles may require an engineering qualification, but the actual title of engineer tends to attract more men than women in job descriptions. So things like, how you post your jobs, what's your job description say about you, and about the roles that you're hiring for. Certainly the candidate experience through recruitment needs to be free from bias. And I think, competency-based interviews, having a diverse panel, looking at sort of how you're hiring, is really critical. Onboarding, again, making sure that you're facilitating all people for onboarding, whether they're remote, whether in office, and so on, and making sure that the information people are getting is relevant for them. As I said, the experience of being psychologically safe in the organization is around that belonging, and that's around employee engagement and allowing employees to be authentic and so on. And then, how you retain employees, making sure that you're looking at your demographics in your organization and paying particular attention to any differences you might have to make sure that your retention strategies are appropriate there. And finally, a lot of organizations are now looking at advocacy. So people sort of acting as advocates for their organization, and also even alumni. So myself, for example, I'm still a huge fan of the organizations that I've worked with and will promote them. And if I see a posting, I'll engage on it. And so as an alumni of those companies, I think the companies have a lot to offer, and I continue to promote those. So promoting that advocacy and alumni element of DE&I is also essential. But we're doing pretty well, I think, in general. Sort of organizations are aware of all these areas and have been working on them for quite a while, and to different degrees of success. And it's still very much a journey. I remember one organization that I worked with, talking about progress over time, not overnight. And that is a real, I think, truism in terms of DE&I on our journey. But as I said, back in March 2020, we all remember, COVID certainly struck, and suddenly we were all at home. And I think this picture on sort of small picture on the right illustrates, sometimes how the home offices looked. It was very much a mishmash of, making things work for you on the day. You were lucky if you had laptops already. If not, there was a sudden sort of pushed to get laptops for everybody and get everyone sort of set up at home. And it was very much a reaction, and everyone pulling together, in a certain sense of novelty, but certainly, a whole new way of working. And I think at that time, the organizations that sort of, managed to kind of get out and get up and running quickly actually saw a massive increase in productivity with COVID. I mean, people were using their commute time now to work. So people were working actually longer and being more productive. But what we also saw on a recent report suggested that, there was a 250% increase in meetings. So we missed the opportunity of having those water cooler conversations, of just chatting to somebody in the corridor, finding out a bit of information. Everything had to be through a meeting, which created intense pressure and a lot of sort of mental health issues, a lot of issues for people trying to manage domestic responsibilities at home, as well as trying to work. So again, a lot of organizations recognize that and try to focus on sort of managing that within their organizations. And I think, we've seen a lot of great examples, and I'm sure some of you have some amazing examples that you can share. But I think the future of work now is hybrid. And I don't think there's any going back from it. I think, there are certain roles that always will need to be done in the office. I mean, manufacturing environments, very difficult to look at a hybrid, although I do think we need to be more creative in terms of how we provide flexibility for people. But certainly, for the majority of office-based type employments, it is hybrid. And I think employers, the sooner employers, grasp that, the better. And that doesn't necessarily mean, 3 days in or 2 days out. There is a level of flexibility. Employees certainly have, in terms of the current employment market, have a strength of voice that are demanding more flexibility at work. So I don't think as an employer, certainly we have a lot of choice around this. And I actually do think it's the right way to go. I mean, the 9-to-5 model of working, evolved from sort of back in the, Industrial Revolution, where it was kind of, was Monday to Saturday, and then it was Monday to Friday. And I think now we're moving to the more flexible work-life arrangement, and it's time we do that. But it does present some challenges. And I think certainly, some of you might have seen the Irish Times report this morning that talked about some of the challenges around that, and how hybrid working is impacting different, I suppose, cohorts in the organization. Certainly, we've seen that some of the concerns that I've seen sort of in my roles are around, on the positive side, the flexibility, the work-life balance, and the employee experience can be so much more positive in a hybrid environment. People, feel they can they're not sort of tied into that locked into that 9-to-5 Monday to Friday piece. They can, manage sort of, home and domestic responsibilities. They can manage their well-being a lot better with a bit of flexibility. But on the other side, I think, and something we really need to be concerned about, is an unequal playing field. When everybody was remote, I think, we actually created, I observed that actually in my organization that I worked with, I observed actually a much more equal playing field. So everybody was remote, everybody was on the Zoom call, and for those of you who have been on a Zoom call while others are in the meeting room, you know how difficult it is to interject, to have your voice heard. But with everybody remote, everybody was in that Zoom environment. Now we've gone back to this mix of remote and in person, and it is creating that unequal playing field. It's also creating a thing called, I believe, sort of a proximity bias. I'm absolutely guilty of this, the in-group versus the out-group. So, for me, I like going into the office. I enjoy that interaction, and I perceive that people in the office are more engaged, perhaps more, anxious to learn, interested in their role. And that's simply not true. I know it's not true, but I still can't help thinking it. And I really have to hold myself in check in terms of that in-group versus the out-group. And as managers, it's really difficult to maintain contact with somebody who's remote more of the time than people who are in the office. You're getting that constant feedback from people in the office about what's happening, what's going on, whereas you have to be much more deliberate with the people who are remote. And it is driving, I think, an unconscious bias that we absolutely need to be, so aware of, that it really presents a challenge for us. That culture and connectedness, I think, in the organization has broken down, between hybrid work and managing DE&I in the organization. And it's something that we haven't quite figured out yet. I hope today that some of the messages that I'm going to share with you help you with that. And certainly if you have anything to share, we'd love to hear, because we're all trying to figure this out together. I'll give you an example of an organization that I worked with very recently, and this is actual data from the talent management process. So the talent management process in this organization looks at 4 tracks. So there's 4 tracks for people through sort of assessment and conversations with their manager and feedback from their peers. People are assessed along either develop to grow, sort of that's somebody who's maybe new to the role, stretch and test, which is somebody who's good, but you want to stretch them a little bit and see how, if you can sort of make them sort of ready for their next role. Plan for the long term, which means, yes, they're doing, really well in their job, but they're ready, we need to kind of look at sort of the next 12 to 24 months for a move or a new role or something bigger. And people who are ready now, so ready now to take on that next role, to step up in a role. And when we looked at this and looked at the data for underrepresented minorities, and this organization did actually capture a lot of data on relation to people, self-disclosed data, there was a significant gap for overall promotion representation. So those people that are ready now in the underrepresented minority population. So that are people who are, so underrepresented minorities, just to clarify, are people who are not your major population. So in this organization, the major population were white males. There was an underrepresented group of women, there was an underrepresented group of different nationalities, and underrepresented groups of LGBTI community, and an underrepresented group of people with disabilities. So among those groups, there was a significant gap in terms of their promotion readiness. Excuse me. In terms of the VP plus pipeline, so that is the pipeline sort of for those senior roles in the global organization, women represented a significantly lower proportion. And then while underrepresented minority representation was trending in the right direction, both populations were actually quite small. So, there weren't very many women or underrepresented minorities in that VP pipeline at all. And so even though it is starting to trend in the right direction, the population is still so low that it really is a big risk for us, that we won't have senior women and senior, underrepresented minorities ready for those senior roles. Overall, in the development tracks, as I said, women were underrepresented in develop to grow, and in stretch and test and plan for long term. So they were actually, aggregated, actually it should be the other way around. They were more represented in those areas than ready now. So apologies for the missed typo there. And the underrepresented groups were a lot of them were placed in develop to grow. So rather than any of the other categories. So certainly we see this would tell us that women and underrepresented minorities are not seen as ready for promotion, are seen as having more to do in relation to their readiness for promotion or readiness for more development. And this to me really looks at a bias, because there's no real reason for this. We looked at all the other data and it just doesn't make any sense. So we have a lot of bias built into these areas, and the big work now is to try and understand those biases and try to overcome them. For me, I think managers are key in all of this. I think managers, need to be authentic. Managers are those people who are closest to the employee population and, who understand their needs. So managers acting with purpose, to enable employees to really be authentic, for both themselves and within their teams. I think managers showing genuine care and respect. And I think we saw a lot of this during COVID. The employees were really concerned for their managers were really concerned for their employees and for their well-being. And it was through the managers that we were able to really, make some positive change there. But also managers being adaptive and flexible, and ensuring that whatever arrangements are in place support their team's needs. Obviously, it's customer first, then team, but the individual does need to fit into that equation. And all of this generally, this is a Gartner slide here, it's human leadership. I'll give you 5 takeaways of things that matter, I think, for managers. I think, informal training and development. Think about how does the ad hoc learning happen? The water cooler chats, the sitting by Nelly, how we learn as individuals, particularly those early career people. Another organization I know has a lot of early career people in the office, but not very many managers. And how do people learn? I mean, they can't learn unless there are more senior people, more experienced people around to help those conversations. I think the proximity bias, which I'm guilty of, making sure that we eliminate that proximity bias around evaluation and assessment. So not necessarily thinking if you're in the office, you're better than those that are out of the office, or finding ways to really understand those people that are working remotely, what their impact is. And we're going to have to work harder at that. It's not that simple. I think cultural integration, connecting teams, and especially around moments that matter. So celebrating, end of quarters, end of months, or key achievements, or even birthdays and anniversaries, making sure that there's an opportunity for teams to come together. Again, Salesforce would have a great process around volunteering, and it's a fantastic way to bring teams together to do something meaningful in the community. But the team getting together is as important as the community impact that's happening. I think, balancing choice and parity in terms of what should happen in the office and what can happen outside the office, really having that purpose for being together in the office. Things like obviously customers, customer meetings, they should be in person, but maybe team meetings should happen in the office rather than being a mixture of remote and in person. Maybe, quarterly planning or, manager one-on-ones, maybe they should be in the office. Again, I would have had a practice of having my one-on-ones, on a certain day of the week, and everybody will be in for that day. And that makes sure everyone got a chance to see each other and connect and reconnect. I think monitoring advancement of talent with a DE&I lens, a diversity and quality and inclusion lens, is something that we've still a lot of work to do on. I think we have inherent biases in how we look at talent, particularly, as I said earlier, that proximity bias, and making sure that we're really super conscious of any biases that we might have in relation to people who are not around every day and we don't know that well. Finally, I want to reassure you that we're not alone in this. These are Gartner's HR priorities for 2023, and you can see leader and manager effectiveness is the most important thing. So helping leaders and managers manage in this new environment, but also organizational design and change management. How do we make the future of work? And within that context, then what is the employee experience? Recruiting and the biases I've mentioned, and the future of work, I think really is a summary of all the previous 4 columns. All of these things relate to the future of work. And I think that's what we're all working on. Now, I know some of the other speakers are going to touch on these topics and give you some more additional information, but I'm more than happy to answer some questions at the end, either through the chat, as Margaret and Siobhan said. And I just want to thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Terry. Yes, and so if you have any particular questions for Terry, please do pop in the chat. We will also be having a bit more of a group Q&A after the other 2 presenters. But my goodness, Terry, I mean, there's so many things that you touched on that were just light bulb moments for me. I loved your honesty around that presenteeism and that proximity bias. And I loved you sharing, because I think we all have it. We have that, you ask someone how they're doing, and oh, I'm busy. And oh, if someone's in the office really late, well, then they must be working really hard. So how did you come to even being aware of that bias, and how do you kind of tackle it? Because I'm sure lots of people on the call will, if we were honest with ourselves, admit we have a bit of that in ourselves too.
And yeah, I mean, that's just one bias that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are other biases that I'm not even conscious of. But I think, I think being so close in HR, I suppose, working with managers and, being that coach and advisor, and, recognizing in others really, and holding the mirror up to myself and saying, gosh, I do that. I do that. I actually value people around more than I perhaps value people, who are just getting on with it outside the office. But I also, I'm a social person. So for me, I like the social interaction. I like that environment. And, it's not hard for me, but I'm not probably closer and not as close to people who aren't like that. And I have to work on it. So it's really, it's really holding the mirror up to yourself and saying, how am I doing this? So I'm a big fan of holding the mirror up.
I love that, and that's really helpful. I'm sure that will resonate with a lot of people in the call. I'm conscious there's so much more I could ask you, but I'm conscious of time, so we will come back to questions, because we have our next speaker, Joanne Mangan, Employers Lead for Grow Remote. Joanne, over to you. I look forward to your presentation, and I'll come back for questions.
I'll turn off my mute first. Thanks, Siobhan. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen with you, if you bear with me for 1 second. Okay, if you can give me a thumbs up, if you can see it, that would be great. Perfect, thanks a million. So my name is Joanne Mangan, and I work for an organization called Grow Remote. We're a social enterprise, and we are very passionate about the potential for remote work in terms of its social benefits. And we help companies make the transition to remote. We partner with companies who are already remote, and we help people who are looking for remote jobs to find them. For us, remote work is a real game changer in a lot of different ways. We're very focused on the impact for local communities. If you unlock jobs from city centres and make them available to people across the country, then you're opening up opportunity. But I personally am also very interested in the impact of remote work on diversity inclusion, particularly gender equality, but also other areas as well. So I'm just going to talk through some of the things that we have learned at Grow Remote over the past 2 years since remote work became more mainstream. So I have a couple of key messages, and the first is, I'll start with the positives. Remote work does open up opportunities for people who may not have thrived in the traditional 9-to-5 office environment. And that can cover quite a variety of people, from people with caring responsibilities, people with hidden illnesses who may need to go to regular doctor's appointments, people with disabilities. There's a range of people with different life experiences who may have struggled, even personality types actually. There's some really interesting information out there about introverts, people who are a little more shy, a range of people. So remote work really does unlock a lot of opportunity for those people who just would have struggled in that very traditional 9-to-5 office setting. So a couple of positive impacts that we've seen from companies who have made the move to remote work. One is Meta. Meta announced a remote working policy earlier in I think this year, and they have already found a very positive impact in terms of their diversity and inclusion goals. And they have specifically cited the shift to remote work as a driver of this. Also, Spotify, who launched a work from anywhere policy, have seen some really positive impacts of their move to remote work. They've seen an increase in their female leadership population from 25% to 42%, which, as we know, is really important, because while you may see more women in the workplace and higher participation of women in the workplace, the women in leadership positions, women are still underrepresented in those cohorts. So it's really interesting and exciting to see the impact remote work is having there. Spotify also in the States particularly have seen an increase in its African-American and Hispanic population as a result of their move to remote work. So these are all really good data-driven impacts that we've seen so far since companies are moving to remote work. So some more general, I touched a little bit on this at the beginning, the different cohorts of people that can potentially benefit from a move to remote work. On a wider scale, if you think about remote work as a means of unlocking a job from a location and making it available to people all across the country or even across Europe, some companies make jobs available across the world, then suddenly you have access to a much more diverse and rich talent pool. You're no longer limited by the people who are living within proximity or commuting distance to the office. So with that, even just thinking about that, you could be looking at people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, people from different parts of the country. It really opens up a wider and richer talent pool for organizations. And then if you get into specific cohorts of people, the Open Doors Initiative, who are a non-profit organization who support people with disabilities, they produced a report. I have some links here, so I'll share the slides after. They produced a report which said that remote work could potentially be a game changer for people with disabilities. Couple of reasons for that. In a remote world, people with disabilities feel more comfortable. They're less likely to have to hide who they are. Accessibility is a factor. Not every office is accessible. Commuting to the office can be a challenge. Public transport in Ireland can sometimes not be so accessible. Parking cannot be so accessible. So remote work does make work more accessible. Also for people with caring responsibilities who are in the main still women, and that can be children or elderly parents. And remote work, there's evidence to show that remote work is enabling a greater participation of people with caring responsibilities, mainly due to the flexibility aspect of remote working. Obviously, you can structure your day better if you can work remotely rather than if you have to be at your desk at 9 in the morning. Some data from the CSO recently, they asked people who were engaged with home duties, so people with caring responsibilities, and also people who had long-standing health problems, if they would consider taking a job, if it could be done remotely. And you can see the numbers there are very high. 75% of people with caring responsibilities and 69% of people with health problems would consider a job. So you think about these cohorts of people who can be underrepresented in the job market, or in the workplace, suddenly having the ability to participate and engage in the workforce, and how impactful that could be for their lives. So a couple of more benefits. We recently did some work with As I Am, who are a charity supporting people with autism. They have produced a report which shows that remote work can provide new opportunities for workers with neurodiversities. Some data from the States again, there were a survey of 10,000 knowledge workers, so a massive population were surveyed. More than 80% of Black, Asian or Asian Americans and 86% of Hispanic workers preferred hybrid or remote working arrangements. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's also impact on members of the LGBTQI plus community. And a lot of that, again, is feeling more comfortable to be your true self in a remote setting, feeling less pressure to mask or to fit in to the dominant culture in the office. I think can really have is really having a driving effect on some of these statistics. So, but there's a big but, right? Like everything with diversity and inclusion, there's nuances. There's a lot of underlying inequities and inequalities in the world, and remote work is certainly not the silver bullet to address some of these issues. There's an expression if anyone is interested in feminism or in women, gender equality, there's an expression, you can't just add women and stir. And it's the same thing with remote work. If you just add remote work to the mix and expect it to solve all the problems that exist in the workplace when it comes to DEI, you are mistaken, because it's not going to mix unless you change the underlying structural inequalities that can exist sometimes in the workplace. So what are some of the challenges? And actually, Terry touched on a couple of these, and they're really important to be mindful of. So presenteeism and proximity bias, particularly in a hybrid environment, can be a real challenge. And if we look at the data I just showed you there, where you're looking at people like people with caring responsibilities, people with disabilities, leaning more towards remote working as a preferred option, you can, if you play that out to a situation where you have more workers in those situations working remotely, while more people who are, white, male, cisgendered individuals who are coming to the office. I mean, that's quite an extreme example. I don't think it's as black and white as that, but you have to be very careful that people who are working remotely are not in a two-tiered system, that they have equal access to opportunity, they have equal access to time with the boss, they have equal access to promotions and projects, and that you're not falling into the trap of your proximity biases. Also, there is some evidence to show that remote work can exacerbate some hidden behaviors. So it can make it a little bit easier sometimes to have hidden behaviors, negative behaviors. There's some evidence to show women, for example, are less likely to speak up sometimes in a Zoom meeting, more likely to be spoken over in Zoom meetings. There is some evidence to show an increase in harassment online. It can be a little bit easier to hide that. So again, these are just things that organizations need to be mindful of. Networking has always been really important in the workplace, and I don't know how many, I think I say every day something about the water cooler moment. And that was a way that individuals could get some time with the boss. You know, you could stay around after a meeting, maybe go for coffee, and something positive can happen in that conversation, and people who are working remotely can miss out on those opportunities. So again, thinking about people who might traditionally struggle to move up the ladder, it's really important that they are still getting networking opportunities, that it's not an office first policy, that you're taking into account that you have a cohort of staff who are working remotely and that they have equal access to that face time or that time online with the boss or with decision makers or with people who can help them in their careers. Employee resource groups have always been really important in terms of diversity and inclusion. So in a remote setting, it's a little bit harder because employee resource groups, so say your women's groups, your LGBTQI plus groups would have events, and they'd be really promoting those events. There'd be a lot of visibility about these events and people could participate. So that has moved to online now, and a lot of companies have told us they're struggling a little bit with that they're worried that there could be a negative impact on people's ability to get together and support each other, and for other people in the organization to participate in these events as well. Remote work can be a distraction. Like I said, you can't just add remote work and stir. You have to look at those underlying biases, underlying inequalities and inequities that exist in the world today, and not just assume that you just put remote work on top and everything's going to be rosy, and not to make the assumption that because you are offering remote work, life is going to be easier for individuals who might, be a little bit less able to thrive in a working environment. So there's a lot of other things you need to do to make sure that your workplace is inclusive, whether that's virtually or in the office. So a couple of best practices that we have seen and heard from some companies that we work with. So the first is having a remote first approach, and remote first doesn't mean remote only. So a lot of companies are looking at hybrid models. We are seeing some companies who are going fully remote, but regardless of whether it's a fully remote or hybrid, you need to take a remote first approach. And that just means that the office is not the center of decision making, and the office is not the place where your career progresses. It means that you're taking a remote lens across the business, and you're taking into account that you have a cohort of your staff who are working remotely and that they have equal access to everything that the people who are in the office have. If you take a remote first approach, you're really able to mitigate against some of the challenges that I talked about in previous slides around presenteeism and proximity bias, but it's very challenging. So it really is a cultural shift, which again is something I say a lot, but it's not easy to shift culture, right? It's quite difficult. So I tell companies this is a change management project that you need to be prepared to undertake if you want to reap the benefits of remote working, and you have to look through the entire organization, all your processes, all your policies, and you need to reinforce it continually. So you need champions within the organization who are reinforcing this kind of behavior, and making sure that you are taking this approach so you don't have that two-tiered workforce. Obviously, you need to have your policies in place, your anti-discrimination, anti-harassment. They need to be robust, and they need to be reinforced continuously. You want people to be living these policies every day. You don't just want it to be sitting on a shelf somewhere gathering dust. These are things that need to be implemented and lived through your everyday working experiences. Investing in training for managers and employees is very important, just to make people aware of these things, make them aware about their biases and how to address them, make them aware of how to have conversations with people if they see something that they think is not okay, that they can feel that they can have a conversation, and how to approach that is really important. Think about flexible and family-friendly policies. It's not, it's a really risky thing if we start to say, well, isn't remote working great for women with children now? They can all work remotely, and sure, that's fantastic. No, that's not what we're looking for. It should be across the board. Men also want to spend time with their families, and they want to participate in their home lives. So it's important that your policies are family friendly. Somebody said to me recently, it's not even family friendly, it's life friendly. And that's what comes with a proper remote first approach, that you're also applying flexible working hours, that people are able to structure their days in a way that suits them. If they need to take time off in the middle of the day to collect the kids from school, that they're not penalized, that you're not thinking, well, they're not really that interested in their career if they're taking an hour off to collect the kids. And that also people can work later in the evening if that suits them as well, but being very mindful that you're keeping an eye on people, that they're not overworking, but just really adding a lot of flexibility to the day so that everyone knows they can work remotely and everyone knows they can be flexible, and it's not going to hinder their career regardless of their situation. Listening to a diverse range of voices is very important. So when you're thinking about your policies and your processes, just look around the room and see who's in the room, and make sure that you have a diverse range of voices, because people's lived experience is really important. You can't make assumptions. Review data is really important too. So take a look at your hires, your promotions, what your management team looks like. Keep an eye on that, and review it regularly to make sure that you're moving in the right direction. Embedding a culture of allyship is really important. One organization I talked to recently said they really miss the visible allyship you can get sometimes, say during Pride Week, for example, where people are wearing their Pride flags and their lanyards, and there's flags around the office, and it just gets everyone really interested in supporting that community. And without the ability to do that face to face, it can be very difficult. But it doesn't mean it's not possible, because a lot of these things can be done online. You just need to take a different approach to it. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means you have to be very intentional about how you're doing things. You have to be very deliberate. It's not as organic as face to face. So these things don't just fall into place. You have to really think about it. And again, have people involved, have a team of people, have your champions within the organization that are going to help embed this culture. And the final point is, make sure your office is also accessible and that your virtual environments are accessible. So for example, for people with disabilities, is your office accessible? Are you putting time and effort into making sure that it is? And also in a virtual environment, Zoom is a good leveler for people with disabilities, for example, but you also need to be thinking about, if someone has a visual impairment, for example, are you using are people describing themselves, because somebody, if you're not able to see in a meeting and you have somebody who has an issue with their sight, then you should try and have a policy where people describe, I'm Joanne, I'm wearing a stripy jumper, I have glasses, and that just helps people feel more included. The same with people with hearing difficulties. Make sure you're using closed captions. So just take a look at your virtual environment as well and make sure that that is fully accessible for everybody. And that's me. Anyone who wants to talk to me, that's my email address, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. So many interesting topics there, and I'm looking forward to unpacking them. We do have a comment in the chat though, so I'm going to jump to that first from Niamh Frawley. Hi, Niamh. She asked, hi, Joanne, in terms of employee resource groups, what can small SMEs do to replicate the benefits of these type of initiatives when they don't have headcount to populate those larger groups? So if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question for SMEs, actually. And I was kind of mindful when I was putting my presentation together that a lot of the learnings I have are from larger organizations who have the population and also the resources to invest. But I think with ERGs, there's two ways of looking at it. You don't necessarily have to group people into groups and keep them separate from the rest of the population, right? So back to that idea of allyship. If you have a couple of people on the team who are members of a certain community and they want to share with everybody, what it's like to be a member of that community, how they can get support from people, that can be done by a couple of people. It doesn't have to be a big group. I worked in a software company in Galway, and we had 40 people there. And we got together, we did a women in tech group, about 3 or 4 of us, but we presented to everyone on the team about what we wanted. And people were really interested and really wanted to get involved. And this was, guys as well as women. So you can look at doing something across the board, and you can get people involved who may not be members of that specific community, but are really interested in supporting and providing that allyship. And actually that is much more impactful, I think, than just having a group that meets themselves and doesn't really embed them what they're doing or share what they're doing, educate people about what they're doing to the wider population.
I love that. And for me, what I'm hearing is that concept of amplifying voices rather than segmenting them and saying, well, we fixed it because we've given you a group. Actually, no, we're amplifying the voices and bringing everyone else on that journey with us. That's wonderful.
Absolutely. And actually, one of the most impactful things is if the leadership are involved, because they are able to provide support and show that visible support in a very positive way. And I think it is very important that they participate in any kind of get-togethers or events online or offline, whatever way it's done, that they're also showing their support too.
Love that. Conscious of time, but we have another question and then we will go to our final speaker. So, hi, Joanne, what advice do you normally give to companies who are concerned about monitoring productivity and KPIs when working remotely? So that's touching on both yourself and Terry's comments about, that proximity bias and presenteeism. So any thoughts on how we measure that?
Yeah, and I again, I've had so many interesting conversations about this. So in an ideal world, you build a culture of outputs. You're measuring outputs rather than hours spent in the office, or how much, if someone's coming in at 8 in the morning and is still sitting at their desk at 7 in the evening, and you say that that's a great worker, obviously, you're actually measuring what people are doing, what they're producing, what their outputs are, rather than presenteeism. And you build your KPIs and your targets around that. There is a shift in the workplace now, but I don't think it's fully mainstream yet, but we're seeing it a lot, particularly in the tech sector, which is, it doesn't really matter how many hours you do or whether you're at your desk at 9 and you're still there at 7 in the evening. It's about the work that you're producing. And if you need to have flexibility in your hours, that's fine. We're just focused on your well-being, your engagement, and what the work that you're doing. Having said that, I don't think that has filtered down across to a lot of organizations just yet. And a lot of managers are worried, how do I know if my employees are working? You just have to be careful not to over monitor people. I think you just need to set clear targets and goals and communicate, be really open with your communication. But I'm very wary, and I don't know what Terry would say here, I'm very wary of this idea of checking if someone's online, and employees as well. They feel then they have, there's such thing as digital presenteeism as well as in person, where you feel like you have to be showing that you're online in the evening or late, or answering emails late in the evening. Employers have to be very careful about that.
Oh, very much. It sounds like, going back to what Terry was saying around psychological safety and belonging and inclusion, it must be hard to feel safe and belonging if you don't feel trusted and you're expected to account. Actually, we heard stories during lockdown of people having to have their cameras on the entire time, but to prove that they were physically at their desk. And so I love that approach of output rather than time put in. And actually, what I'm hearing as well is a common thread between yourself and Terry around needing to appreciate we've been firefighting for the last couple of years, and it possibly feels like we're always firefighting. But what it sounds like is there needs to be that investment in taking some time and planning ahead, because the rewards sound like they will be absolutely exponential. Okay, thank you so much, John. We'll come back to you for more questions, but for our final speaker, we have Geraldine Carr joining us from Matheson. She's a partner in the Employment, Pensions and Benefits Group. So here to provide some of the hopefully good news from a legal perspective of what is coming up to reinforce DEI from a hybrid perspective. Thank you, Geraldine, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Siobhan, and our other speakers, and thank you all for joining as well. It's really interesting discussion so far. And I'm going to give you just an overview, a little bit of some of the legal frameworks that are in place that actually support and promote a lot of the principles we're talking about here about diversity, equity and inclusion in the workplace. But certainly, I suppose at the start, just to echo what the panel shares, there's no doubt that hybrid working arrangements have the potential to really offer a high degree of flexibility and a better work-life balance. But I think we also very need to be conscious of the flip side of that, where they can create potential biases and, as was reported on the papers this morning, an unequal playing field for it was identified for women in the workplace, and I think it can create the biases that we've talked about today. So it's really important that remote working and flexible working arrangements are rolled out in a way that don't inadvertently put hurdles to progression and promotion in front of those who avail of those arrangements. And so your HR and employment policies that are in place in your employee handbook are key to get right, and to keep reviewing them and revising and updating them as well, as we all figure out this new hybrid working environment that we're working in. We've seen the commitment to diversity and inclusion move from being a HR or managerial type initiative in the last number of years to actually being a priority board level initiative, agenda item. And I think that's really important. It's to echo the point that you made, Joanne, there as well, that leadership is key. Leaders and managers need to model the appropriate values and lead by example and really participate in these discussions and in the working groups that you mentioned, Joanne, as well, so that it's not seeing not creating a then and us environment, but actually very much supporting and modeling that this is a really important issue that we all need to try and continuously work at. And so I suppose from a legislative perspective, you can see on the slide there that there are various different legal frameworks, being proposed and underway at the moment that will help to promote diversity, inclusion and equity in the workplace. So by way of roadmap today, I'm going to look at the gender pay gap legislation in the first instance, and then move on to talk about the Remote Work Bill 2022, and then the Work-Life Balance and Miscellaneous Provisions Bill. I'll then talk about the right to disconnect, which I think will kind of complement some of the points you made there, Joanne, about this always on culture and people having to feel that they need to, if they're working remotely, that they need to prove they're working, working as hard as maybe their individuals who are present in the office. So the right to disconnect code of practice is helpful to kind of address some of those issues. And then I'll speak finally about some practical measures for employers to think about to address these issues as well. But just on to the next slide and the first topic. So the gender pay gap, I mean, this is a really important initiative from a diversity, equity and inclusion perspective, looking at it through the gender lens, of course. So it's important to note that at the outset, the existence of a gender pay gap within a business is not necessarily a red flag for discrimination. And there's a lot of confusion about this, where people equate a gender pay gap to unequal pay. But to echo the point that Terry made at the outset. Diversity is about representation in the workplace, and the new gender pay gap reporting framework, which has come in Ireland, is about the representation of women across an organisation and across various levels in an organisation. And it's to give a picture of that so that organisations can begin to look and address unequal representation and to promote diversity, equity and inclusion in the workplace from a gender perspective. So I suppose to give an example of where a gender pay gap might arise, it's the example that's sometimes given is the software engineer. So where, for example, a tech company has a huge volume of software engineers, and traditionally that role was occupied in the main by males, because the vast majority of students graduating as software engineers were male. But that is changing now. We're seeing far more females take on those courses in universities and graduate from those, and as a result there is a shift in the dynamic in the workplace. But certainly it's probably going to take some more time for that to even out, and so there may be a gender pay gap where you have an organization with a disproportionate number of males versus females in a particular role that is predominantly a male role traditionally. So I suppose the key point to note is, from a gender pay gap perspective, the organisations are really looking at this year, because for the first time, employers with over 250 or more employees in Ireland must report their gender pay gap by December of this year. And in terms of looking at their headcount, employers are captured if they, at a particular snapshot date in June of this year, had 250 or more employees, and they then must report by 6 months later from that snapshot date. Just to note that there's a relatively small number of employers who have over that headcount threshold in Ireland. We think it's about 450 to 500 employers, but we are seeing more companies who don't have that headcount threshold electing to report and to carry out the exercise of running the figures in order to see what their gender pay gap statistics look like and to be able to take measures to address it. And there's also certainly a market pressure on employers where their competitors, for example, who are captured by the requirements to report are reporting, and then those, that drives greater number of people preparing the calculations and reporting, which is positive as well. And just in terms of the headcount threshold, that is going to reduce over the next couple of years. So it'll reduce next year, or in 2024, to 150 plus employees, and then it'll reduce again to 50 or more employees from December 2025. So then in terms of what information must be published, well, it's the difference between the mean and median hourly pay and bonus pay of male and female employees in the workplace, and that includes the difference in the mean and median hourly pay of male and female part-time employees. Employers also have to publish differences in the proportion of employees who receive benefits in kind and bonuses in particular are the areas where we're seeing quite a lot of questions coming from employers around that. What falls into the bonus? Do you apportion the bonus? So there's a lot of tricky calculations to be done in that context. But I suppose, without diving into the detail of that, I think the key takeaway for the gender pay gap reporting requirements that have come in this year is that employers must also publish a statement setting out the reasons for any gender pay gap difference that they have identified, as well as the measures that the organisation is taking or proposes to take to address any pay gap that has been identified, and to try and reduce or eliminate such differences. And it's certainly this area is the area that we're also doing quite a lot of work with employers on, because it's so important to be able to contextualize the existence of a gender pay gap. To use the software engineer example, it can be due to a variety of internal and external factors, and the purpose of this statement will really be for employers to try to explain that and explain what they're doing, what examples they are using that Terry and Joanne gave to try and address those diversity issues in their workplace. So I expect that from December onwards, we will certainly see quite a lot of media reports around gender pay gap reports that have been published, and what organisations are doing to try and address these gaps. So on to the next slide. The next point I'll talk about then is just the right to request remote work bill. So I suppose to try and promote hybrid and flexible working models, the Irish government has certainly accelerated the advancement of a number of legislative developments which do promote diverse and inclusive and equitable hybrid working environments. And this has certainly been accelerated even further by the pandemic, which was really the major catalyst for putting this on the government's agenda in the first place. So in terms of the right to request a remote work bill, I guess clearly the sudden shift for individuals to working remotely during the pandemic made the government recognise that really there should be a statutory right to make a request to work remotely. And while the government first published their general scheme around this in January 2022, it was misreported at the time by some media outlets that this conferred an automatic right on individuals to work remotely, which is not the case. Instead, it is a right to request that they work remote or work remotely. And so the framework envisages procedures being taken by employers and employees when they're making such a request, that employers fairly assess the request and consider it, that they take a certain amount of time to consider it. And it does build in a non-exhaustive list of about 13 business grounds where employers can refuse an employee's request to work remotely if, for example, it has a substantial adverse effect on the business or it isn't suitable for other business reasons. So clearly this has been met with great dissatisfaction by a number of employee and union bodies, as they feel it is too broad in terms of allowing employers a broad justification for refusal. But it's certainly an area that we have to watch. The government announced yesterday that they are actually going to combine the right to request remote work bill with the work-life balance and miscellaneous provisions bill, which I'll talk about shortly, and that they are also going to accelerate their plans to address those that bill and those issues in the coming weeks and months. So I think this is just a space to keep an eye on, because we may see some developments on this very shortly. And then just to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the work-life balance and miscellaneous provisions bill then this was basically brought about in order to transpose an EU directive on work-life balance into Irish law. We were actually given until August 2022 in Ireland to transpose this, which that deadline has now since passed. But I suppose since yesterday's announcement, we now know that it will also include the right to request for remote work, and that it will be accelerated to a priority for the government. So the key measures proposed in that bill are to increase the rights available to parents and to carers. So it's going to bring in a right for employees who have children up to the age of 12 or 16 if the child has a disability or long-term illness, and also for employees with other caring responsibilities like caring for parents or other dependents, to request flexible working arrangements for a set period of time for that caring purpose. So it's not a permanent arrangement as such, but that they might request some adjustment to their hours or to their the number of hours or the time of days in which they work in order to facilitate their caring responsibilities. The second, I suppose, proposed change by this bill is that it will give employees a right to up to 5 days of unpaid leave per year where for serious medical conditions, employees needed to provide personal care or support to a family member or to those in their household, such as a child or a partner, cohabitant or a parent. So I guess the key thing there is that it is unpaid and it's for serious medical reasons. So the employee will have to provide proof of, the medical condition in question and that their care is needed for that purpose. So this will be something that employers will need to build into a new policy around requesting time off, and it's different and separate to force majeure leave, which we currently have in place. Another, I suppose, change that the work-life balance bill is looking to bring in is an increase to the period in which new mothers are entitled to take paid time off during working hours each day to breastfeed. So currently that's only available for the first 26 weeks, which is quite short. So the proposal is to increase that to 104 weeks or 2 weeks, or 2 years, of paid time off to breastfeed. So that's a very positive development. And then the final change proposed by the bill is the right of transgender males who obtain a gender recognition cert and if they subsequently become pregnant, to fall within the scope of Irish maternity protection legislation and avail of maternity leave and so on. So another, I suppose, change that is worth mentioning, but that doesn't come within the work-life balance and miscellaneous provisions bill, just to confirm we already have this in place, but it's parents' leave is also in place and entitles each parent to 7 weeks leave during the first 2 years of a child's life, or in the case of an adoption within the first 2 years of placement, for example. So this is separate and distinct to all of the other, parental leave and family leave entitlements that are in place. But I think it's worth mentioning because it's also evident of the government's support and promotion of, family leave entitlements. And this is proposed to increase again to 9 weeks from August 2024. So again, just want to keep an eye on in terms of updates to HR policies in time. And I think, look, this also evidences a huge shift in where we were. So post 26 or prior to 2016, the only statutory paid time off for work for fathers really was in respect of was for force majeure leave. There was no paternity leave entitlement. They didn't have parents' leave that they now have. So there's certainly quite a lot of development in this area, which is really, a good recognition of the shared responsibility of parents and does address diversity in the workplace as well. So just to turn then to talk about the code of practice for employers and employees on the right to disconnect. This is important, I suppose. It's not a statutory right to disconnect, as has sometimes been misreported also, but it is certainly a guidance note for employers and employees, which establishes best practice principles around an employee's right not to routinely perform work outside of normal working hours, and the right not to be penalised for refusing to attend to work matters outside of their normal working hours. And that code of practice very helpfully provides a sample policy for employers to put in place. And this was introduced by the government as well to try and address that always on culture that developed, I think, particularly during the pandemic, and to try and promote a culture where employees feel that they can disconnect from work and work-related devices outside of their normal working hours. I've certainly in my practice had a lot of conversations with employers when this first came into place, around employers really looking to progressively and proactively address this and build in policies, and also try to embed those policies around disconnecting in their workplace. By way of certain examples, they were promoting the use of using the delay send function in emails, Outlook, when emails were being sent by employees after hours, you know, that they would delay it to be sent the following morning, or else you'll all have seen the footers in emails where people say, I'm sending this now because it's suitable for me, but it doesn't need to be read until your normal working hours. And different measures like allowing people to commute home from the workplace on the days when they are working in the office during off-peak times, so that they're not stuck in traffic, and those kind of very practical measures are being put in place by employers in order to address I suppose the always on culture and employees working late into the evening. So I think those are also just very practical and positive measures that will support DE&I in the workplace. And then just on the last point, just to turn to some practical measures to keep DE&I in track in hybrid workplaces. And these are just some points that, you know, we've been engaging with our clients on, and which we have learned through their practices also. So, you know, communication is absolutely key, and this has been touched on by the panel already as well, that, you know, every organization really needs to communicate their values in the workplace and their values and commitment to DE&I, and illustrate examples of how people can live those values in practice, because I think it can be, without those very practical examples, it can be very hard for people to know what they should be doing. And Joanne and Terry gave some excellent examples, and Terry's point about, you know, holding up the mirror to yourself and asking you, where is my potential bias, I think is super, because I think that's just a really practical tip for leaders and managers and everyone to take away as to how can they try to subtly make differences that will actually make probably a very big impact in practice the more they are promoted. Training was touched on already as well, but just to echo and give you some examples of what I'm seeing on that front. You know, training used to just typically cover on the HR employment side, maybe just anti-bullying, harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace. But now in recent years, we are extending that training to cover things like unconscious bias, inclusion, cultural awareness, inclusive language, neurodiversity. Throughout the pandemic, when people were entirely working remotely, a lot of the anti-harassment and bullying and anti-sexual harassment training that I was giving was given in the context of the remote working environment. So to touch on the point that you made, Joanne, earlier about how harassment can also arise in a virtual environment, you know, we had to adapt some of our policies on that and the training on that to show that, you know, the examples, to give the real life examples that reflect the new working environment. So I think that's just something for organizations to consider as well when you're looking at your policies and the training that you roll out on that point. On leadership, I touched on this already, but just that it's really important that leaders model the appropriate behavior on this and are you know, not just paying lip service to DE&I, but certainly, you know, keeping it as a recurring agenda item and challenging each other each day, you know, with any biases that you see, and trying to role model good behaviors in terms of disconnecting, you know, including people who are working remotely or working in a hybrid way, and so on. At a recruitment and promotion level, you know, Terry, you mentioned it's important that there's diverse interview panels, and it's crucial. And I've seen clients actually defer their interviews taking place where it wasn't possible on a particular day to have a diverse panel, or if someone was unavailable due to sick leave or something, that they actually just paused and said, we don't have a diverse panel, we're not going to proceed today. Or also where they were going with an internal promotion process and then considered, you know, that their pool wasn't really diverse enough internally, and they decided to go external in order to look for a candidate that might be suitable and that would also bring that diversity into the organization. So I think that's just something to note, that organizations are really willing to I guess consider all of this in the round, and not just look with the internal lens, but to consider, do we need to go external to try and increase our diversity? And then in terms of your policies and your measures to combat visibility, you know, it's crucial to keep reviewing and updating those HR policies, like the sexual harassment or harassment one that I mentioned, your remote working policy, and you know, your dignity in the workplace policy, all of those just in the context of what we're talking about today, to make sure they reflect the current environment that employees are working in. And from a partnership perspective, I see clients and companies often collaborate with organizations who share their values and have an aligned commitment to promoting DE&I in the workplace. And I think that's really helpful as well, that, you know, there's organizations across different sectors coming together. So I'm going to pause it there just to allow some time for questions as well. So I hope you find that useful.
Thank you so much. It's great to see so much progression happening to kind of underpin all of the change that we've been talking about so far. I'm conscious of time, and we'll need to open it up for questions on the wider audience as well. But if anyone has any particular questions for Geraldine, please do pop them in the chat. And I was struck by what you were saying about the remote work bill, and I don't know if anyone's following what's happening with a certain social media company at the moment. I'm sure they would love to have the opportunity to request remote working when there's talks of being forced back to the office. So I suppose that's kind of an observation for all of you on any suggestions on, sorry, to go back to Joanne made that lovely framing of unlocking a job to make it accessible rather than simply letting people stay home. So kind of an open question for you all on any suggestions. Hopefully we've got some decision makers in the room, but anyone who maybe needs to go back and have that conversation, how can they help with that reframe to say, we're not just letting people stay home as maybe perceived, how do we help people unlock a job to make it accessible? Perhaps we start with Joanne, if she's got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think like anything, when you're talking to business owners and company owners, you have to frame it in the light of a business case as well as a social impact. And I think if you can convince on those two fronts, you're onto a winner. And I feel like with remote working, we are getting to that point. It's still early days, so there's a lot more data that we need. But I think you're able to see the positive impact remote working is having in terms of better productivity, better work-life balance, happier employees, job satisfaction. I met a guy from Airbnb recently, and he said when they said they were working remotely and they announced it, they had 1 million hits on their job site. So people are looking for remote jobs. So that's a good business case. But you can also have a positive impact on your employees and on the wider society. And there's so many things I haven't even touched on in terms of, you know, less emissions through commuting. There's so many positive impacts. So I think companies, I mean, it has to work for companies. It has to work for employers as well as for employees. But I think if companies get that takeaway that it can be good for your business, it can be good for society, it can be good for communities. It's like it reminds me a lot of gender equality, and that started to really catalyze, I think, when companies started to realize not only was there a good social benefit, but there was also a good business benefit. And it's the same with remote work. Remote work can make your business better. So that would be my pitch to any company who's thinking about it. Happy to help if there's anyone on the call who wants to get some support from us. Just go onto our website. We do a lot of training for companies who want to make the move to remote working.
That's great.
I had to throw my pitch in there at the end.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you so much, Joanne. I am conscious of time, so if there isn't any further questions from the audience, I just wanted to throw one last thing, because I heard it throughout all of you around. Am I right in understanding that the 9-to-5 model, the Monday to Friday, it sounds like we're kind of ready to put that in the bin to a certain extent, that's a bit outdated. And what I love actually to tie it in is I read an article by Rishika Tulshan and Jodianne Bury that went viral in the Harvard Business Review about how, you know, we talk about imposter syndrome, but actually if the world of work was never designed for us in the first place. So if that Monday to Friday 9-to-5 doesn't work necessarily for even the straight, white, able-bodied male anymore, it definitely wouldn't work for all the men and women who don't fit that model and don't fit that mold. And so it sounds like between all your presentations, you're really calling it out that, like it or not, the world of work is changing, and hopefully for the benefit of everyone, but not a silver bullet, as Joanne pointed out. It won't fix everything. Thank you all so much for your presentations today. I think you've given us a lot to think about and a lot of actions to take away, and we will, I'm sure, all be keeping in touch and connecting with you on various social media and so on, and look forward to another event in the future. Margaret, I'll hand back over to you to close out the session. Thank you again.
Thanks a million, Siobhan, and thanks so much to our speakers, Joanne, Geraldine and Terry, and yourself, Siobhan. That was really, really, really valuable, and plenty of food for thought going into the weekend, plenty to reflect on. Once again, thanks to your audience, and of course to my colleague Vicky, who works on technical support and puts together this series with me. Finally, a thanks to our sponsors, our valuable sponsors, so Cork Chamber Skillnet, Gas Networks Ireland and Matheson. They've been a great support throughout this year and throughout this series. Would you believe this is our final session in 2022? We covered topics ranging from urban revitalisation, electric mobility, energy efficiency, and today's session on equality, diversity and inclusion. So that's the breadth of topics, and we hope to be back next year in 2023 with a new programme, a new series of discussions that we hope will be of interest and provide value to you, and that you'll participate and join us again. So once again, thanks a million, and we hope to see you again. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. Thank you.